You know, with the stark reality of climate change now very much a reality, we're really urgently in need of experts who are thinking about what the future is going to look like for humanity. And so we're really lucky to have people like Dr. Johanna Nalau to guide us through these difficult times. Dr. Nalau is an award-winning adaptation scientist, and she's a lead author for Key Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports. She's co-chair of the Science Committee of the World Adaptation Science Programme, and she also leads the Adaptation Science Research Theme at Cities Research Institute at Griffith University. Today, she's going to help unpack the concept of adaptation. And thankfully, it's not all doom and gloom, because she'll also highlight some of the emerging and exciting ideas about how we are going to thrive in this rapidly changing world. Over to you.
All right, thanks, Jo. And thanks for inviting me to come and do the talk. Yeah, I'll just make sure. Yep. Yeah, so my name is Dr. Johanna Nalau. I'm based on the Gold Coast in Queensland, and my research topic, as you can guess, is adaptation. So what is adaptation to climate change, and why do we need it? So I think in many countries, adaptation and climate change in particular has been quite politicized. So often we still, in some countries, get into the arguments, is climate change happening? If it is happening, what's actually then, what does the future look like? And so I thought that it'd be interesting maybe today to unpack some of those concepts and talk about also some of the research that we do here at the university on adaptation, but also to highlight some of the new ideas that are actually already being put into place to have a more sustainable society. I'm hoping this works. So I think if there's one thing that I would like you to walk away with today is to understand that adaptation to climate change is really about a new mindset. It's a new way of thinking. And there's two really kind of core reasons why that's so. So when you start talking about climate change adaptation, the first thing that we need to do is to accept, first of all, that climate is changing, that the scientific community, the scientific evidence on climate change is getting stronger and stronger each year. And we already see a lot of the climate impacts starting to unfold. So the first thing to do is to say, yep, okay, so something's already changing. We've already seen climate changing, and there's a lot more changes to come in the future. And the second step then is to go, okay, since that's the reality or the new reality, what can we do? So how can we start preparing and making sure that our communities are safe and can thrive in changing environments and changing conditions? So when we talk about adaptation to climate change, it's really looking at things that we can do today, but also thinking about the future and looking at the climate modeling and the climate scenarios, and also, what are some of the impacts that might happen and impact the place where I live and where I like to go for holidays. And, it's starting to understand that, a lot of that change is going to be personal, but there's massive impacts coming on the communities and the places that we live. Sorry. Yeah. So, sometimes people say, oh, but, climate's not changing. We haven't really seen anything. And I think in this slide, I've tried to provide some illustrative examples of some of the impacts that have already been happening, but also what we are likely to see a lot more in the future. So the first is the Australian Open. So 2019, they actually had to stop the Australian Open because it was over 40 degrees, so the players couldn't actually play. And a lot of the sports, both in Australia and New Zealand, are often outdoors. So there's quite increasing temperatures will bring a lot more hot weather, and with that comes heat waves, but also quite big implications on many of the sports that we love to do particularly outside. And in Australia, there has been already this movement of sport professionals at the moment actually calling for the government to really recognise the massive impacts that climate change is already having on sports and will have in the future. The second is obviously the quite big bushfires that we've had. So 2019, 2020, probably the worst bushfire season and events that Australia went through. And the modelling is suggesting that a lot of those kinds of events will have more fires and more intense fires in the future. So when we start thinking about adaptation, it's really about thinking, well, if that's the new reality, if that's the kind of fires that we are going to be facing, where can communities be safe? How can we improve disaster and emergency management? And how can we, train the firefighters in these new changing conditions? Because some of the reporting, for instance, coming from during the fires, where the firefighters said we've never ever seen this kind of event happening, and there was a lot, they didn't know what to do, and there were fire tornadoes and things that they hadn't experienced before. So we do need to start having that conversation in terms of before the next fire season, before these events get worse, how can we train our professionals, but also create awareness in the communities, about these impacts. And obviously there's a lot of the younger people in the audience. There's lots of infrastructure that we have on the coast, lots of cables, power stations on the coast. And so sea level rise and increasing flooding and increasing extreme events will have quite a big impact on that infrastructure. I often ask, what is the world like if we can get on Facebook? And so just quickly on Australia. So Australia has been investing in adaptation science for many years, and they have just released the National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy. So that's really outlining the kind of broad principles in Australia that are required for effective national adaptation. And I do have to say that a lot of the adaptation implementation is already, and planning has already been going on for years in local governments and also state governments. So we are seeing really, really strong action and policies and already implementation of those plans in many places in Australia. But we still need a nationally coherent and effective approach, how we can coordinate a lot of the adaptation action on the ground as well. And probably many of you have been following COP26. So that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they have a meeting every year where all the countries come and make decisions on both reducing greenhouse gases, obviously. So that has been a big focus. But this year there was an increasing focus on adaptation as well, and some of the good outcomes were for adaptation. So the increased adaptation finance for developing and least developing countries significantly. So for instance, the Adaptation Fund that has most funding for adaptation got, I think, 350 million, and there was lots of action and lots of support for national level adaptation all across the world. So some good news there, though, although the reporting on the COP26 obviously hasn't been otherwise that positive. But when we start talking about climate change adaptation, I think there is all kind of mistaken belief that, we'll just throw more money at it and we'll be fine. And this is a piece that we wrote with a colleague a few years ago on The Conversation, and said, well, look, adaptation is actually about hard choices because it is about priorities. It is about making decisions, which areas or which communities we should be really helping to adapt and where we might not be able to. So, when we talk about the future, often we think that, it's just, business as usual, and then we just keep putting the sea level up slowly. Whereas, especially in coastal areas, there's going to be some really hard decisions. And this is why a lot of the adaptation research and action is with communities, and, having those conversations and starting to say, well, if this beach is going to be eroding, 7 to 8 times every year, some of the kind of structural measures might not be enough. So it is also about starting to have those early conversations. And adaptation, it is about our values and priorities. So what I find interesting in the research that we do here at the university is looking at adaptation heuristics. So there's kind of fundamental assumptions that a lot of us think how adaptation to climate change should unfold and why. And we each carry, our own perceptions and our own kind of frames about what the problem is and how we should go about solving it. So our research here really looks at the decision making and kind of mindsets and thinking processes, how people reason, what we should be doing now, what can wait for later, and how can we respond to adaptation in an effective and just manner as well. And so some of the research we'll also do is looking at future visioning. So, what do people think about the future, and which factors are actually affecting that? So it's a very different different kind of future vision if we somebody who's 15 and then we ask them, oh, well, what's the next 30, 40, 50 years going to look like? When we have people who are maybe in their 60s or 70s, it's a very different kind of future visioning, their kind of visions, what is even possible or what the future should or could look like. And this is something that I also teach at the university, and it's been really fascinating to see, how people have really different visions and kind of values as to what should be maintained and what effective adaptation can look like. And it is, very much in our minds. So at this point, so it is about imagination. It's what we even think is possible and our perception of, well, what is the problem. I think I would add to these slides, as I said, as values as well, and agency. To what extent do we think that we are capable, as individuals or as community, to actually then take action and start making decisions to have the kind of future that we want. And so, as I said in the beginning, adaptation is about new ways of thinking. I thought I'd, with some of the next slides, I'd show some of the really, really cool ideas that are out there at the moment that are not business as usual, but are trying to change what business as usual should look like. As this is probably one of the most famous economists, Kate Raworth from Oxford, and she has been advocating and creating this framework on donut economy. So it is about creating a safe and just space for humanity. And it's a very different take, because it's all about, trying to have a low carbon, reduce waste, sustainable society, instead of the way that, a lot of our, for instance, our cities have been built. And what's really exciting is that even though, she's created this framework and, is presenting this new way of thinking, actually it's not just theory. There's, especially during the pandemic, there's lots of cities actually. So one of them is Amsterdam, who said, okay, they basically paused all their planning and said, this is what we want to do. So we want to take this model, this donut economy, and we want to model the city of Amsterdam to function like that, so that there is, almost no waste. It's a just and safe society. And so they're actually right now implementing the donut. And there's more and more cities and countries even who are looking at this model and say, yes, we want to reduce waste. We want people to be happier. We want people to be healthier. So how can we all come together and do that? And this might look a bit out there, but this is Oceanic. So it's a company who is talking about how can we live with water. And so their kind of vision, what you see here, is that what if cities would actually be on water? And this is the same. It's like pretty much zero waste, sustainable energy, green energy. And so you have particular islands where you would do the food production, and obviously you have solar and other energy systems there. And it is especially, if we think about small islands and small island developing states that are, facing really massive impacts from sea level rise. So thinking, this thinking is already being being implemented and kind of taking as a new potential model as well. And this is actually an example from Copenhagen. So in Denmark, they already are thinking, well, if we have more water, we have more people in the city and we have less green space. So how can we kind of, solve many problems at once? And this idea is about floating parks. So you increase biodiversity, you give green space for people. And the idea is that if there's, for instance, a big event somewhere in Copenhagen, so that these little islands could actually be moved there. So if there's a festival or, there's like a big music festival or art festival or gathering, so these would kind of have multiple benefits. So it wouldn't be just living with more water. It would also be increasing, the health and well-being of people and giving them spaces to go to and still experience nature, although in a bit of a different way. And another initiative I thought I'd highlight that's global. So that this sits with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it's called Resilience Frontiers. And it's another example of a new way of thinking that's really relevant for how we adapt to climate change and how we also maintain resilience. So it's called Resilience Frontiers, and it sits, as I said, with the United Nations. So every time there is this kind of convention meeting, there is also a resilience lab, and I believe this was the second or third year that they were running the lab in Glasgow. And it's all about how can we make sure that we have a permanently sustainable society by 2030 and beyond. And it has, for instance, 8 different pathways. So it's all about ecosystems. So how does every person on Earth actually kind of increase biodiversity benefits rather than that we just keep taking benefits from nature? There's a really big focus on Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous understanding and being. And what we can learn from that and how we can reach more harmony with nature. And I've been involved with the initiative for a few years now. And it's really interesting because it is a new way of thinking, but a lot of people, when we have a discussion and we say, okay, what does a world look like that's sustainable, that's 2030 and beyond? What does that look like? And a lot of people, I found that actually we really struggle with that. We struggle kind of seeing a positive vision. So when if we ask the question like, well, what does the world look like 2030 or 2040? And there's, all these climate impacts and rising sea levels, increasing temperatures. And talk about the kind of worst case scenario. It's interesting that a lot of people go, okay, yep, this is what it looks like. But when we have to articulate the positive vision, a lot of people struggle with that. And that's where I think this initiative in particular has been really influential in opening spaces up for people to have positive conversations and understanding these kind of new innovations that are already out there. So that could become mainstream, that could become our new normal. So I found this initiative, you can, they have their website and you can also sign up to follow some of those ideas. And they have this initiative also, what they call the bright lights. So, this kind of a bit out there innovation. So how can we make protein out of air? They're looking at different companies that are really at the cutting edge of innovation, delivering, more sustainable options for people and organizations and the private sector. So it's a very exciting initiative. And I saw this quite a few days ago when I've been doing research, and I thought it was really nailed down for me what needs to happen for us to move forward. And it says moments of great historical change are underwritten by shifts in collective imagination. And, we as individuals, we can do so much, but when we come together as a community or as a group, we really create movement. But I think it is about, finding that shared vision. And that for me is what climate adaptation is about. It is a different way of thinking, but it is also about this kind of collective imagination, understanding the kind of world that we could have, and starting to look for strategies to move us there, but also what we can stop doing that is, contributing more harm or disbenefits to our society at the moment. And, a lot of the initiatives that I've talked about, they might seem like theory or these kind of out there ideas, but a lot of companies and a lot of organizations and a lot of movements are already, really starting these discussions seriously. And a lot of my research actually is about this, kind of gap and link between theory and practice, the kind of theoretical ways that we think about innovation or we think about climate change, how we should be adapting and what's possible. And then what then happens when we take those ideas and start putting them into practice. And I think for me, so I've been researching adaptation since 2007, and I think the more I research it, the more complex it becomes. But I am really convinced that it is a new way of thinking. It's a new perspective that we need to embrace. It's not just because that's what science is, but because we already see a lot of the impacts that are happening, and we have an amazing chance right now to start making better decisions in how we live our lives, but also how we build and plan our societies. So that's it from me. So I'd be more than happy to take any questions and hear what you thought, or whether there's something that wasn't very clear.
Thank you, Johanna. That was fantastic and really, really useful and positive information there. There have actually been quite a lot of questions, so we can jump straight into it. And we've got about 10 minutes, so I reckon we can probably get through a few. So I'll start with this question from, in fact, it's actually, I'll combine two people's questions together because they're quite related.
Yeah.
So Pamela Glickman asked, what do you say to people who think adapting to climate change means giving up on preventing/mitigating it through reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And then my co-MC Craig asked, does the idea of adapting to climate change give us a free pass to not attempt to reduce emissions?
Okay, so my stock answer is that was yes, that was the case in 1990s. When these discussions and organizations started, and at that time we thought that this climate change thing, we got it under control. We solved the ozone layer issue, so climate change will just do the same. Turns out that we didn't. So I think in the 1990s, it's a very different way of thinking, because we thought we had that control, and there was a lot of anger actually among people who talk about adaptation. Whereas I think we've massively moved beyond that discussion. So I think if you ask any scientist, and especially with these international negotiations, it's really clear that we need to reduce both greenhouse gas emissions, but we also really need to start having a conversation how we can adapt. So it's a great question, because I think for me that signals even more the need of having the discussion on adaptation. And even we see in Australia, it's still, we really super urgently do need to reduce emissions, but some of the impacts are already locked in the climate system. So we don't have the luxury of going, we'll just, we don't have to adapt, let's just think about that later. And one of the things with adaptation, if we just don't start putting in the thinking and the policies and strategies in now, it's going to be insanely expensive as well, when we start seeing climate impacts at the drastic scale.
Absolutely. That's a really, really interesting answer. So the next question is from Mark Honeychurch. Are there any adaptations to help deal with climate change that would make sense even to people who don't believe that climate change is real?
Oh, fully. And that's, I think, as my research is about the, decision making, also perspectives and framing. So I think it also depends how you frame it. And it's interesting that people often, for instance, people who live on the beachfront or in the coastal areas or are being flooded or, you know, have been impacted by bushfires, you know, they don't always even need, you don't need to even have that conversation sometimes. It is more about the more immediate, you know, whether it's erosion or whether it's, well, you know, rebuilding communities or homes. So I think there's lots of adaptation strategies that are actually already on the way, that are not even labeled adaptation, that are going to support, you know, how we adapt to climate impacts.
It sounds to me also like, you know, we often talk about the language that we use when we talk about things like vaccination. We've shifted from talking about herd immunity to talking about community immunity. So the way we use to sell things to people, it sounds like it's quite important in getting them on board with things.
No, absolutely. And I think there's, you know, especially in countries where there is still some level of kind of political debate about climate change, I think in a lot of those countries, so for instance, under Trump administration, they completely shifted talking about disaster resilience. And so a lot of those, so the work could go on. So a lot of those initiatives that help our communities, you know, they have been kind of, you know, reframed or rebranded kind of under different terms so that we can keep the work going.
Okay, so I have a question from James Milton, who says, building on the previous questions, what is the risk of this happening and how do we mitigate it? We absolutely need adaptation, but how do we do this without it coming at the cost of mitigation?
So a lot of the options and strategies that are being recommended and looked at, so there's, you know, like hybrid approaches, but there's also trying to understand that some adaptations, so if it's getting hotter, everybody cranks up their air cons. So and, you know, at the time when a lot of, for instance, in Australia and in Queensland where I'm based, a lot of the energy is still coming from, you know, coal powered electricity. So then it's you know, it's a circle that's not obviously positive. But, you know, so a lot of the scientists, a lot of the policymakers and politicians are starting to understand that whatever options we put in place, they have to be focused on reducing emissions, but also supporting adaptation. So there are, for instance, I know the hybrid approaches, you know, there's lots of renewable energy approaches, but also, for instance, on the coast, you might be looking at combining quite many options. And for instance, planting more forest on the coast then has the, you know, is reducing also or acting as carbon sinks as well. So there's lots of interrelated discussions, but I think like one of the key things is that whatever adaptation strategies we put in place, that we don't just keep ramping up emissions on the side.
That's fantastic. So that I think that's all the questions from the audience. I actually had a question for you myself. You know, I suppose, and of course, as I keep saying, is the running thread of the convention is COVID-19. You know, COVID-19 has been really the first major global event in a really long time where the world has had to sort of come together to work on a big problem. So I'm just wondering, you know, what lessons have been learned? Have there been any lessons learned about how the world has worked together or not worked together on dealing with this global pandemic that you think could be useful in, you know, climate change adaptation?
No, absolutely. And we actually just wrote with some colleagues a comparing kind of climate change and adaptation as a you know, problem for policy, and then thinking, well, what can we learn from COVID and vice versa. I think one of the key lessons for us who work in climate change is that the pandemic has clearly shown that countries and governments can act, you know. So a lot of this kind of, with climate change, we are frustrated with the slowness of policy action often, and, you know, and it's all about, oh, but it's in the future and maybe it's not happening, maybe it's not, and then some countries just don't do much, whereas the pandemic has really clearly shown us that if there is a understanding of the size and the severity of the threat and risk, countries can act, governments can put in place. So for instance, we talk about, I'm not sure how it has been in New Zealand, but in Australia, you know, the government said, okay, well, we are going to have this lockdown, and the state governments in particular, and they said, okay, well, how are we going to help economically those people? So they put in kind of really social security payments, you know, for people so they can stay at home, especially if they have COVID, but otherwise as well during the lockdowns. So, and in some countries that's actually unheard of. And we've seen that kind of same trend happening across. So, you know, so that's just kind of one example. And another example is probably the understanding of how interconnected this world is now. So we've seen massive impacts on supply chain. People are kind of waking up and understanding, oh, well, this product actually comes from, you know, this country. And I think there has been a lot of, so even with my friends, I do hear that they do think about it more now. Where does this product come from? And especially trying to make better choices in, you know, buying more locally, not just because it's available, but also to support like local small businesses. And we've also seen communities just coming together, and like one wonderful example is the kindness pandemic on Facebook, where people just share these stories about strangers coming and helping them. And I think that's created like this new understanding that, you know, even if we are in a globally connected community, there's still so much kindness.
Oh, look, and I think that's a really wonderful note and a positive note to end on. Thank you so much for a really important and interesting presentation. And I think that we are now going to get ready for the break.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.